Welcome, everybody. Before we begin, I'm going to start with a brief mindfulness exercise. Um, as I read these words, today may elicit a response from you. And when needed, we just ask that you pause and breathe and look around the place that you're in and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. But as I read these words, see if you can just listen to the words and see if you can notice any vibes come up for you, any images or thoughts, any meaning making, perhaps behavioral urges or feelings and sensations. So the words are from Tony Berland. And the more personal and introspective a work of art is, the more universal it is. Just pause and notice for a moment. And welcome everybody, and turn the time over to Carlos.
Hey everybody, my name is Carlos. I'm one of the clinicians for the Rape Recovery Center. Shared my screen just to begin with some resources here that, what we're talking about here can be, activating for some individuals. So just want to list some resources here that you can either jot down or visit after this event if needed. This will also be shared in the comment section after the show as well. So what I'll be doing here is really just quickly sharing the prompt or the catalyst for this event, which is a book titled Under Saturn's Shadow, The Wounding and Healing of Men by James Hollis. And the intent, and I guess you could say the goal of this event is to have an intimate view of the psychological process utilizing and using art to heal from trauma. The takeaway that I hope everyone can get with this when the event's all over is to have additional tools to utilize to connect with kind of the other side of ourselves, the more introspective, the more subconscious part of ourselves, which I'll detail a little bit about this book in the next slide. So what this book really talks about is 8 secrets that men hold to themselves. And by the end of the book, they talk about 7 steps men can use to heal from those 8 secrets. So before I get into that, I do want to just provide kind of a framework of what is Jungian psychology. So Jungian psychology is really the foundation of it, is that the human being is a meaning-seeking individual. What that means is that us as humans, men, females, and the spectrum in between, that we all seek meaning in our lives on a subconscious level. And that meaning in life is created by whatever our psyche or our souls kind of are born with or tell us who we are. And that we experience suffering, we can experience defeats, and we can experience even trauma and still feel rightness in our lives when we're connected and truly engaged and are okay with who we truly are. With creating estrangement or distance from what our souls are, what our psyche tell us to be, is where we start developing defense mechanisms, where we can start projecting, overcompensating, or essentially living a life in denial, trying to be something that we are not. And that in itself can create a lot of inner conflict, which can create a lot of what we see as mental health pathology, depression, anxiety, and the symptoms of the likes. So here in this next slide, these are some of the secrets that James Hollis talks about. And I'll just keep a moment here, maybe a few seconds here, just in silence so we can read these to ourselves. And I'm curious as, which ones in your mind stand out to you? Which ones do you lean on and say you agree with, or which ones cause conflict within yourself of, hey, I'm not sure if this is true or not, because that's all for valuable discussion as well. And a point that I would like to focus on, one that stands out to me just at the moment, is point number 2, that men's lives are governed by fear. And generally speaking, men are taught, as well as females, to live by certain scripts. And, generally speaking, a lot of men may believe these scripts or be able to adhere to these scripts that are programmed either by society, by family structures, by our own cultures. And a lot of that, if it does not align with our solar psyche, what that starts to create is a fear-based behavior. So we start behaving out of fears rather than what we truly feel may be right or true to ourselves. So that in general creates a life based out of fear, which, as I mentioned before, can lead to kind of those pathological type of responses of denial, overcompensation, or trying to meet the expectations of this invisible thing that we are trying to please. Another one that stands out to me as well is point number 4. Men collude in a conspiracy of silence whose aim is to suppress their emotional truth. And not sure, how many men may be able to relate to this, but something that the book talks about, especially post-industrial revolution in Western society about men, is that when we look at spaces where men can be truly authentic and emotional, they tend to land in one of two spaces, which is either in war or in sports, is where we kind of see this acceptance of, hey, it's okay to cry, it's okay to be vulnerable in these spaces, but outside of those spaces, there isn't a space to truly be vulnerable. And what that causes is kind of not only an echo chamber of what is allowed and not allowed, but it also is this subconscious agreement between men of, hey, these are things we can talk about, these are things we cannot. Anecdotally speaking, out of personal experience, I have been in many social circles with men where, where someone can be vulnerable and share something that may be more authentic to the self. And what tends to happen is there's someone that throws in either a joke or someone that tries to not dampen the mood, but lighten the environment just because it is something difficult to talk about. And then there is never a follow-up or a space in between to really hone in on what we wanted to share. I also want to talk about point number 3. The power of the feminine is immense in the psychic economy of men. And this book, if it's something interesting, definitely something to pick up and read. But what it really talks about is how much of our lives, when we talk about spaces where we can be vulnerable, it talks about the relationship with mothers and other women in our lives and how that can create essentially an unhealthy dynamic where we may, as men, put the burden of having these, our emotional spaces taken up by people that we think are supposed to carry these pains or these emotional processes for us, when in reality, it's something for us to own, something for us to engage with as men, internally as a self, and then also with other men who are in that process as well. And here are the other 4 secrets that I would like to share as well that the book talks about. I'll give just a few moments here so we can read those to ourselves. And the 2 points that I would just like to talk about in this one as I read through these is point number 7. Each man carries a deep longing for his father and for his tribal fathers. And what the book talks about is the purpose and the power of a community, and a healthy community of integrated men that mentor essentially the next generation of men. And when we look, something that the book really focuses on is after the Industrial Revolution and World War I and World War II in Western and American culture, what tended to happen was man became a product of their productivity, where there was longer worker hours, men were less likely to be at home. And what tended to happen was a gap was created between the mentorship of fathers to their sons. And what the book talks about, living under Saturn's shadow, what that really means is having an estrangement with our souls, and that there's been generations of men that never got to then never had the opportunity to live their true selves, because day by day they were living to the responsibilities that were told to them, you know, to provide, to work in and day out, and to essentially be a product for society, for capitalism, or forever, whatever the driving force of that generation was to be. So it's a deep longing that many sons and many men and boys feel, is a longing to connect with other men, and to connect on an emotional basis with them. Another point is point number 8. If men are to heal, they must activate within what they did not receive from without. And the did not receive from without is talking about our society and culture, that it is our responsibility as human beings to heal ourselves, and that there is power in that. And as human beings, we do have the capacity to reach that if we are given the tools and if we are given the guidance for that. And part of this event is seeing how we can use the arts and our creative outlets to tap into that subconscious level of ourselves, to start that process of healing. And these are the 7 steps to healing that James Hollis talks about, is to remember the loss of the fathers. So to acknowledge the pain and the wound that had been inflicted on us, of not having that mentorship in its full integrated aspect. To share those secrets, those 8 secrets, and to be vocal about them with each other, and what that means, of which ones align with us and which ones don't. Point number 4, I think, is very valuable. Risk loving men. That it is okay to have deep, emotional, intimate relationships with other human beings, especially with other men, with our brothers and our communities, and to connect with each other on that emotional basis. And throughout this is to recover our soul's journey, or your soul's journey, which is really just to get to know ourselves, to free ourselves from that fear, from those scripts of life that have been institutionalized in us, and really get to tap into who we really are and who we really want to be. What is the story that we want to leave on this planet? And step number 7, I think, is always, I like how it ends on, is to join the revolution, which basically means as we integrate these truths, as they sit with us, that part of that journey is sharing it with others, which is one of the purposes of this event as well, is to start to awaken other minds who may vibe with this and say, hey, it is time for me to essentially to mature and grow up in certain aspects that may have not been developed in ourselves due to our upbringings or just to the experiences we have had in our lives. And part of that is, as I mentioned in the beginning, to utilize the arts in that aspect. So we have the blessing today to hear from Jesse Parent, who is a spoken words artist, and he will be sharing his poetry with us. And we gave him a copy of the book. We let him know about these 8 secrets, and what he did with this was use this as a prompt and a catalyst to share some of his poetry and his work that align with these messages, and then we'll have a Q&A with them about this process with them. So with that said, I pass over my time to Jesse Parent.
Hello, friends. My name is Jesse Parent. I am a spoken word artist. I am also a survivor. I have some poems that I want to share with you, and I want to start off with, this is one of the first things that I've ever written from a performance poetry standpoint, and it talks about what Carlos also mentioned about how sometimes we use humor to heal, but we need to come back to that and figure out what's really underneath there. Scott Green and I started the same summer in 1993 working at my uncle's tattoo parlor in East Providence. He was always blaring Deep Purple and trying to turn me on to Black Sabbath and other bands with too much hair. And we'd celebrate late nights at Bigford's with coffee and the occasional creamer that would defy gravity with its viscosity and consistency. The man's ink covers much of my epidermis. On February 20th, 2003, at the Station nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island, Great White played a small concert to a capacity crowd where 100 people spent their last night snuffed out by flames. And one of them was Scott Green. He had tattooed the lead singer the day before and been tipped tickets to his demise. News was scarce, and I wondered how such a heavily tattooed man could take so long to be identified, slowly dawning on me with sickening realization just how blackened and charred his ink and skin must have been. Wondering what his last moments were like, clawing through the crowd to get out of there. Seeking solace, I looked to see what others were saying online, the debates on safety, the finger pointing, the question of how could that building have gone up in flames that fast? And the one answer that stood out: hairspray. And with that, I laughed loudly in breakbeats of sobs to the sick song of gallows humor, that inappropriate joking I so desperately needed, clinging to comedy to explain away this tragedy, making one mask out of two. See, we're a sick lot, those of us who need this, like teenage cutters freeing flowing emotion with razor wit, off-color offensive humor between falling towers and breaking levees, making sense out of senses of humor and never giving in to the outraged cries of too soon. Like my dad at his own father's wake, my grandfather, our Pepe, looking at a room swamped with eyes and loudly declaring how Pep wanted to be buried face down so the world could kiss his ass, breaking out this small gag box that would shake and exclaim, "Hey, hey, let me out of here," whenever you bumped or shook it. Dad threatened to put it in the coffin with exploratory glee. But on a shady funeral day, while burying our Pepe, my father broke. Emotion flowed out of him as he was handed a triangular flag, and for the third time in my life, I saw him cry. No cloak of laughter or jokes, just raw sorrow as I turned to hold him, bumping his jacket pocket, laughing loudly as we shook in time to that stupid gag box that he'd hidden there, surrounded by a mess of shaken heads, in 3 sets of 7 shots, punctuated with the cries of 100 tiny people trapped in a box. Hey, hey, let me out of here. And that just is a reflection on how I've gone through and my family goes through dealing with tragedy and how we process it with humor. And that's not for everybody. It can be pretty inappropriate. I should say that my dad is my adopted father. So I call my father my biological father and my dad my dad. Same thing with my mother and my mom. And I know both my biological parents. In fact, they married and I was the best man at their wedding. And it's a really challenging relationship to go through. And I know the book talks a lot about the separation of the mother, and it can be painful. And this is a poem that I did about my birth mother. From Superman to the letter Krypton, from myself to my own birth mother. When your home is taken from you, there is a poison that it acquires, a crippling yearning in the gut that thinks whatever was broken surely could have been fixed, that prays silently and selfishly, let this be someone else's story. And the salt streak realization edging in from the corners that you may be the result of someone else's selfish prayer. I am sorry that the memory of you is so debilitating, so deadly, kryptonite. I know that you never wanted to give me up. You clutched gravity fingers at me desperately, threw pieces of yourself after me, a tearing of your hair, your chest, an exploding core. You wailed soundless in the vacuum. It's no wonder I didn't recognize your voice. And from the beginning of my adoption, you were told that I could never touch you, that every scrap of you was a weakness, an inherited failing. You still fell into my life anyway, glowing green envy at my new home. Or was it just your love radiating? It's hard to tell the difference. See, yellow and blue make green. Regret and affection can mix malignant. Love is not built to seethe through clenched teeth. I wonder if I would have called you Mother Krypton, prayed to your gods, and held the fate of your people in my hands, or would I have been ordinary? Like Jesus when he went to Nazareth, a Messiah cannot perform miracles in his hometown, can't walk on water when he always has to give in to gravity. Would you have weighed me down so much There are good reasons to give up a child, and I'm sure you had them. But the fantasies of regret do not let themselves be colored in reality. And looking back, I can never think of you as deadly. I could never imagine I would be anything but loved and happy, never a burden. I'm sure you feel the same, even as you split disaster, as I fled you, as you released me. What if I had just stayed and been consumed by you, the conflagration of that moment of you, mutually assured destruction? Instead, all I have are the scraps, the kryptonite, the fragments of your seething love. And they don't make me human or keep me grounded. They just hurt. So I wrap you in lead distance, just so I know that you're there. A souvenir of a poisonous origin story, a bit of what I came from that I could never truly call home or mom. I want to move on to something that's a little bit more light, again, kind of going into the gallows humor. That I like to usually plug two emotional values into poems to try to keep a flow going, maybe a roller coaster. This is a poem that is from the idea of patriarchy and what that means to personify what we view as an overbearing patriarchy. Well, come on, everybody. Come on in. I know. You probably heard the tales of old man patriarchy, but they're all lies. Told by suffragists, hashtag SJWs. No. I assure you, I am as harmless as an estranged grandfather at Thanksgiving dinner. Lots of folks don't like old man patriarchy, but I like you. Hashtag not all patriarchy is, oh, look how in touch I am, how I evolve, how I am still here. I like all the fellas and 70 cents on the dollar like all the ladies. And that's a joke. That's a joke. Wage inequality is a lie. But some of the stories are true. I mean, I enjoy watching the sports, young bodies crashing together like clapping hands. Look how hard they're working out there. They really earn the benefit of the doubt. Such a bright future, hashtag Brock Turner. I just wish they'd stop posting all those party pictures. You draw a curtain across a window for a reason, no need to see all that chicanery. Let me mansplain something to you. Boys will be boys, and boys become men, and with jobs and careers in the math and sciences, probably making video games for each other, hashtag Gamergate. Something manly and violent and sticks in your milk teeth like gristle, yeah. I like this new world order, this silk shadow of the internet. Why even old man patriarchy can seem so much bigger, stronger, scarier behind a keyboard. Hashtag Proud Boys. Who'd be afraid of me if they could see me as I am? Who'd take my threats seriously? Laugh at my rape jokes. If they could see the shrivel of my spine and the gaps of my smile, who'd ever feel way against their chest like the deep end of the pool? I mean, look at me. They could see how delicate I am, how close to death, hashtag masculinity so fragile. Why the loss of power is almost like mourning. But trust me, I'm so friendly, familiar. Yeah, let's face it, aren't I all you've ever really known? And that's an example of persona and just kind of changing voice and embodying an idea that is abstract as patriarchy. And that's just a way that as an artist I try to figure out, well, where's this thing coming from, right? I also try to reflect on my own life. And a while ago, the Salt Lake Poetry team, we wanted to create a theme of poems that were interconnected on the buttons on a remote control. And I picked the replay button because there's a lot of things that I'd like to see again. And I want to kind of talk about that with you right now, if that's okay. If life had a replay button, I would pick certain moments and just live in them forever. I probably would have worn out that replay button, losing my virginity, losing my virginity, losing my virginity, because at that moment, it blew my mind that it was finally happening. Or I'd pop back to when I got my first tattoo just to recapture the moment when I thought it was going to hurt so much and watch the surprise on my face before I settled in like an addict and think, wow, I sure had a lot of hair back then. And when I needed motivation to work out, something to really fire me up, I go back to when I got jumped outside that restaurant in Worcester, watch my eye explode crimson, my forehead, a knuckles drum, feel helpless again, get angry again, and then I'd hit the weights and say, never again, I'll never be that drunk again. But that back then, the replay button was working a little bit too well. Drunk and getting in fights, each replay a new scar, each shot as familiar as the start of the last scene, but as hard as the mistakes are to rewatch. It's the happy moments I'd be scared of. Dangerously happy, dripping like morphine, I'd fiend for them. Scratch my arms raw and scab dependent, their withdrawals a fatal shake. I never let the television show of my life finish. Skip past the humdrum commercials of simple living and just binge watch the highlights. Will you marry me? Yes, I do. It's a boy and he's beautiful. It's a girl and she's beautiful. It's a boy and he's beautiful. I love you, Daddy. Look, Dad, no training wheels. My youngest son asking me to teach him about Pokemon and telling him yes. My daughter asking me to teach her to fight and telling her yes. My oldest son asking me to teach him about sex and telling him back to when my children smiled in the shadow of gum lines and missing teeth. I would press down on that replay button as if my weight could halt the growth of their oaks and trap them in a scene of unfortunate haircuts and baby fat unmelted by the wick of adolescence. I would want to relive each beautiful moment again and again and again. I am not strong enough to resist these joys, to think that I will ever be better than this, to think that I am worthy of another memory like it, to think that I am anything more than a drunk, than my scars, than my worst moments. How could God let me be this happy again? I would want to relive each moment, beautiful moment again and again and again. I would press down on the replay button when my children smiled, skip past the humdrum commercials of simple living like morphine, each shot as familiar as the start of the last scene, something to really fire me up. Watch the surprise on my face as I settled in like an addict when I thought I was going to hurt so much that it was finally happening. If life had a replay button, I would pick certain moments and just live in them forever. God, let me be this happy again. That's actually an erasure in reverse, and it's a pretty technical poem, so I apologize for like the volume and trying to like get into that emotional headspace again. I want to take a moment now to slow it down and kind of reflect on the loss of father. Carlos mentioned that in some of the things that he went over, and my birth father 2 years ago passed away, and my birth mother sent me his ashes, and I still have them, but it's been a very surreal moment of dealing, and I want to kind of reflect on that. See, my father's ashes came in the mail the other day in a repurposed brown Amazon box, sealed shut like a pine box, and I haven't opened them yet. I haven't seen the funeral cards with the photo of him kissing his bird or the gray cube of chalk he has become. What do you do with the ashes of someone who gave you up for adoption? What do you do with the remains of someone who said, I am not enough for this boy, that sent me into the wind, spread me through the family until his sister finally took me in, dusted me off, and called me a son? And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of sacrifice, a lifetime of him being called uncle and never being called dad, I shall fear no upheaval if I do not open this box he Schrodinger's back into being, and I can hold him one last time without him slipping through my fingers like so much fine dust, like ash, like a father saying goodbye. because he couldn't hold on to me because he knew he shouldn't. Um, this book also deals quite a bit with uh, the masculinity of elders, of people that you connect with, and of trauma, and how we are fear-based and angry. And I encountered that with my best friend. Uh, and when your best friend tries to kill you in his kitchen, you try not to dwell on the knife block, and you pray that they took away his gun when they took away his badge. That isn't lying, and you pray that the gun isn't lying fat and full in one of his drawers, and stop wondering, why is this happening? Insanity is not a simple recipe. It's just a stove's slow leak. And when he lunges for the knife block, you stop him. You drop your guard. You let him waste his rage against your nose, eyes, and cheeks, and pool your blood onto his face until he surfaces, and know that this is different now. All his pictures will look like this. Every phone call will sound like this, and even his best man speech at your wedding. That dragon tattoo you both have on your backs, the comic books that you drew when you were 10, and now covered in your blood, wide-eyed and panting, and you can never talk to him again, no matter how much you want to. And at some point, you will have to tell this story in the first person without calling him your best friend. I was telling Willie that I didn't want this to be kind of a bummer fest of poems that that dealt with my own trauma, and like I said, I like to create roller coasters, and so I want to take you on the weirdest roller coaster that I have. That trust me, this is a love poem. It's called Hotbox Love. I suppose you're wondering what we're doing here under this comforter. Well, the truth is, darling, I am about to fart. Now, before you get angry or flail madly or hold your breath, just hear me out. I'm not going to promise that this is going to be a walk in the rose garden, though. This is going to stink. It might smell like stale popcorn salted in asparagus, or a cabbage brownie, or something so Velcro and foul it clings to your pant legs like trash juice. I'm not a good judge of where these things are going to go. They call this the love test. Dutch ovens, hot boxing. This is how you know you have something special. It's not about how when you kiss and fall into each other's lips, how electricity conducts from your fingertips into each other's bodies, how ancient languages you blurt out as you climax together simultaneously. A relationship's best moments are fleeting flashes of perfect, the untenable hold of joy. And this is about those less than ideal moments, the times when we are simply human. A loosened booger, a trap door opening and closing with every breath, finding underwear in a trash can and we don't say a word, the conversations you have with each other on the toilet. If you can't love me in this awkward space, just live in this filthy, stinking moment, what are you going to do when it really gets bad? Can you still love me? Throwing up every hour, my bedside table a heap of prescription bottles, my pillow thatched with what little hair I have left to give. Can you still love me? Showering me in a chair, wiping my ass as I sob, I'm sorry to you, throwing my underwear into a trash can without saying a word. Can you still love me? When I struggle to recognize you, call our son by my brother's name, scream when I look into a mirror, my stroke-addled face may hang like a sheet on a branch, wrinkled and absent of cohesion. Just know that there are rings inside of me that are black and burned with the memory of you that I would carve away the bark of me to get at. We may not always be able to slow dance when our wedding song sneaks onto the radio. And the doctor might say, I won't live to see winter, and that's okay. I hate shoveling anyway. Or there may come a day when we are planning my funeral and I insist on being buried in the shirt that says insert wooden stake here over the heart. I hope that you will shake your head and do it anyway. Like I said, I'm not a good judge of where these things are going to go. Not everyone looks forward to being their lover's caretaker, and that's okay. I'm not either. I just hope and pray that you will always love me as I do you in those difficult times. Like this one. Yeah, where we are both under a comforter and I am about to. Is that you? Wow. Is it weird for me to say how much I love you in this moment for that? Um, that is admittedly a very weird poem, and but that is the best love poem I ever wrote for my wife. Um, so I'm gonna take things back to the father, back to the loss of our elders. This is about my dad, my adopted dad, who is still with us and who was a very big part of my identity. And a few years ago, he had a heart attack and needed septuple bypass surgery. And I had to shave him in the hospital. So on shaving my father, no one comes out of bypass surgery feeling the same. Even mountains erode. A small avalanche can't change that this is still a mountain, still my father. He may not move as confidently and test gravel to see what has settled and what still may come loose. See, my mountain father is still alive and breathing the wind, creaking as autumn flows over him. His arms are felled timbers, too heavy to stand up, the black-gray stubble on a land he always kept smooth and polished, as out of place as a wash over a path. To shave your own father is a gentle chiseling, the shaping of a form that was always inside the rock, lather as if the sheet of his face could soften. My father will always be the hills, always jagged, no matter the avalanche, always rising from his hospital bed, always breathing the wind, always breathing, always breathing. I tell myself, trying not to shake, to shiver, to sob. Always breathing. I pray, steadying my hand as the razor scrapes stone. I have one last poem to share, and this touches on the book's theme about reconciling with the loss of elders. And I still have lucid dreams about my grandfather who grew up next door to me and my papa, and it's always kind of traumatizing to me, but I found a way to deal with it. My grandfather waits at the kitchen counter, hovering over the newsprint on folded elbows. He glances and smiles, good morning. It's too early for any cartoons besides Space Ghost and the Herculoids, and he always lets me eat at the coffee table in front of the console television, and I am always careful not to make a mess. What do you want for breakfast, he asks, and I am expansion, barely able to seam in my joy. My mouth hangs open in a gaping smile. My eyes are glass cups under a kitchen faucet. I can feel the words damning against my voice box, and I do not want to break this spell, but I have to know if this is real, and I have to say them. You're alive, Papa. You're alive. And I hear a different child's voice than my own. Daddy? And there is no slow fade. No smoky settling. My grandfather's kitchen is an event horizon. He is the center of a television tube collapsing into a single phosphorus dot. I blink away from my damp pillow. My son is in focus. He plays the game of kisses awake, and his smile holds, waiting. And I remember to smile back, and I scoop him up, and I empty him of giggles and refill the joy in my empty chest. We sneak away and let his mother sleep, heading to the kitchen. The cartoons are always on these days, and I let him sit at the coffee table because I know he'll be careful. And I ask my son what he wants for breakfast. Thank you very much. I will turn the time back to the organizers.
Thank you, Jesse, very much. That was beautiful. I know you've spoken a lot, but I have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay.
You bet.
Yeah. First of all, I mean, we talk about healing, right? And I think for men especially, an obstacle to healing is vulnerability, right? We don't allow, we're not supposed to be vulnerable in a lot of ways. And creating art is a form of vulnerability too, right? So I couldn't help wondering, like, did you use your art to heal intentionally, or is it something that you discovered along the way?
It was definitely a discovery. I was not prepared for this. I've always been artistically inclined, but I grew up in a very masculine household. You know, my adoptive father was a mechanic. My biological father was a tattoo artist. So for me, it was sort of this discovery, this processing. And I won't say that my art is always healing. Sometimes it's very re-traumatizing to go and visit these emotions again and again. And even to realize that maybe the emotions aren't at the same value they were when I first started to process them. So it was very much a discovery, but I think of it as a very healthy process of trying to get out and say, this is what I'm feeling, because I find that it's reflected back to me in a very weirdly universal way. Even the poem about my friend who died in the fire, at the Great White Concert Fire, I have found people who have not only had similar situations, but I've also found folks who have lost people in that same fire, and that I wouldn't have connected with if I hadn't put this out into the universe.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable. And you know, I guess if you don't mind me bringing in Brian and Carlos on this, because they're the clinicians when it comes to, you know, working with survivors and healing. But you said it's re-traumatizing, and I think they can probably speak to that process of bringing up things that are hurtful. And it seems like that's still part of the process, right? Would either Brian or Carlos be willing to speak to that?
Oh yeah, I'll be more than happy to kind of speak to that. And I think something to note as well when it comes to being introspective is I have an understanding of our distress tolerance, right? And that a lot of times when we revisit these stories or these experiences in our lives that can be painful or traumatizing, there's power in having a good understanding of those experiences, because a lot of times when we experience trauma, we tend to not trust our innate emotions about that trauma. We start listening to what other people tell us how we should feel about these things, or how what is society telling me how I need to react based on this? How am I supposed to behave off of this? So a lot of times, although something can be re-traumatizing, it's where as clinicians, it's something that I help people kind of discover is what are my coping skills? What are the things I can use that when I revisit these parts of my lives that I can say, okay, this is starting to feel a bit overwhelming. Now it's time to disconnect for a moment and do something to ground myself again, to kind of help me feel grounded. But there is power in revisiting these stories in our lives and kind of shutting off the voices around us and just sitting with ourselves within that emotion. Says, what is my soul trying to tell me? Because there's pain there. When we talk about a re-traumatization, what comes to my mind is a reliving of the emotional pain that's coming from within. And something that's powerful to understand is that emotional pain that rises within us will not destroy us. It will not kill us. It's our voice. It's something telling us that wants to speak to us, and that it is okay to engage with that. It's okay to look at it from kind of a third person kind of view and say, well, I'm feeling afraid right now when I revisit that, and have that conversation with that inner part of ourselves of what is making me feel afraid? What are kind of the emotions that are attached to this? A lot of times when we really do that type of work, what tends to come out is part of our inner child, a part of our past experience that hasn't had an opportunity to let out its cries. And at times that's necessary, to let out those cries and to really experience that, the weight of the experience. And that in itself is the healing process, is to be able to sit with that pain. Brian, not sure if you have any additional thoughts or just any comments, but I'll quiet down now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Carlos. And as you were sharing, I just wanted to share a line from the book, right? That the double-edged sword of wounding, there are wounds that crush the soul, distort and misdirect the energy of life, and those that prompt us to grow up. Behind one's wounds, there often lies a person's genius. And certainly saw that tonight from Jesse.
And when it comes to Jesse, another question I have is just like, what is your, I mean, once you discover that, you could heal through your arts, do you find yourself using it that way intentionally, or what is your process for creating art?
That's a great question. It's really kind of a personal question.
You don't have to share if you
no. I am sharing. I'm a big fan. The thing that comes back down to it is that most of my poetry is about either my faith or my family, and so both of those are highly personal. And I try to just think about what's going on here. What do I want to express? So I have poems about my children. I have a poem about my wife going through cancer, and just that whole year I couldn't create. I was just so adrift because I was so emotionally fraught of like being a caretaker and trying to make sure that my kids were okay. But I need to get this out, to bang it out. So Jorge, it's a wonderful question, because it really comes down to realizing that I need this and sitting down and just doing the work. And it's not like you can sit down and just say, I'm going to wait for inspiration to pop off, because that's just not how art works. Art is about sitting down, being disciplined, really asking hard questions, and trying to answer them as honestly as you're willing to, and maybe capable of doing, and maybe even a little bit more than you're supposed to, and finding out some truths about yourself that you probably would not have been able to uncover.
I know a lot of people also will not experiment with art because they don't feel they're creative enough or they're artistic enough. Do you have any advice for people like me who experience that as well, who want to try, like what, I don't even know how to ask that question, I guess, in a way, because
my thing is always, I look at the people I admire and I try to replicate that. I try to think about what's their process, what's it look like, and that's why a lot of times you'll see art that gets replicated, and that's a great part of the process, because you start to discover the things that you love about that art, what attracted you to that in the first place, and also to recognize that it's intensely personal. Some art just never should be shared. It doesn't need to be. It's just a process, and if you find joy in it, follow that joy. Don't follow the critic or the critique. Just understand that what you're doing, if you're doing it for your own personal sense of self-being and enjoyment, is enough. And don't overthink it.
Now, you said that you're a father, right? I'm a father as well. And, as someone who works in the prevention field, my goal is actually to prevent sexual violence from occurring. And so I deal a lot with how do we teach our future generations? Taking your experience and your healing process through art that, I would say we're never completely healed, right? We're always working on that. Have you been able to teach or pass any of those skills along to your children?
I hope so. I checking in with my older two are 21 and 19, and we have really intense conversations a lot of the times. And my son, my eldest son, is going through the university through a similar program that I did in college, and I'm able to reflect and honestly be a little vulnerable and say, hey, look, at the middle of this, I wanted to quit. I thought I was worthless. I didn't know anything. I was wondering why I was there. I thought I should go back to the tattoo parlor, my uncle's, my biological father's, and work there instead. And I just kind of had to persevere. and just reflecting on that and saying, look, it's not about being tough. It's about recognizing that this is tough, and that's okay. It's okay to not have everything be easy and have to like really work through in some sort of regimented way. And the other things come up with just relationships and just sharing some hard truths about where I was, either in my failings in relationships, in things where I was victimized, and things where maybe I was less than awesome, and also just in my successes too, and saying, you know, this is why I've been married for almost 25 years, and these are the things that led up to that, because it wasn't easy and we almost didn't make it a couple of times, but it's okay to admit that this is not perfect. Perfection is for fiction. It's just not real. And I think that's the lessons. Those are lessons that I really try to get with my kids and say, like, look, if you think that you're going to live some perfect life, you're wrong. Like, make mistakes and learn from them. And if you don't learn from them, then they really were mistakes.
Now, of the, let me see here. I have a question here I'd like to just forward before I ask another one of mine here. Let me see here. As someone who is also a white man who writes poems to make sense of my pain, I sometimes feel a conflict between a need to speak to the suffering white male supremacy causes for white men and a need to avoid centering my own white male experience. Given that white male supremacy still governs what might be considered valid in poetry and art in general, how do you experience and make sense of this conflict?
I really appreciate that question. It's sometimes it's hard. Like, you don't want to hear the excuse poems. You don't want to hear the poem that says, like, I'm so sorry for this privilege or this or this experience, because it's almost somebody else's tale to tell. The how I like to address it is through persona, through trying to say, like, what's the other side of this look like? Why is, like, why does this exist, and why do people think that this is a acceptable thing, if not a good thing? Or, you know, the folks who are apologists for the ills of the world, and trying to use that lens. And but that's as far out of my lane as I go. I try to make sure that when I'm talking about my own culpability and my own experiences, that I make them as personal as possible. But that doesn't mean that it's good art. It just means that maybe it's a good process. And trying to figure out how to share that process is very tricky. It's super tricky because people don't have the context of what's going on in your head. And you have to try to figure out, how do I make the personal universal in a way that might offend people or might not.
Do you always try to make it universal, or do you aim for personal, or it depends?
You know, that's a good question, because honestly, I find the personal is universal. Even as unique an experience as you think you have, somebody else is feeling that. But it also, being introspective is a way to make it universal, rather than making excuses and trying to figure out, okay, where's the ugliness in here? Where's the gild and where's the rust? Right? It's not just, I'm going to talk about me being a champion of something. It's talking about, like, admitting to my own failures, figuring out how I got here, and maybe painting a cautionary path, rather than saying, you know, I'm some sort of champion that's got my card that says, like, I'm not a racist anymore. Like, I took this class.
Yeah.
I did this poem. Isn't it wonderful? But also, you know, you have to not take things. You also have to not take things personally. I find that too many people, when responding to criticisms about, like, you know, men are really, they don't realize that they're not talking about you, the man. They're talking about their experience with an entire portion of society that is weighing down that person to the effect of, like, they can't stand it anymore. And just listening to that and saying, you know what, this might not be about me, but it might.
Yeah, that's a classic issue I try to explain in my work when people say not all men. It's like, you're taking it personal. It's not about you, right? It's about everything else. You know, you talked about, you know, feeling like your experience is unique, right? And so that's something that a lot of survivors, you know, express. or a reason why sometimes they don't reach out, because they think no one's going to understand. No one's going to know what's going on. So to Brian and Carlos, since they work with a lot of survivors as clinicians, can you talk a little bit to that? Like what causes that? I mean, sexual violence is obviously way too common. But yet when a person feels it, they feel very isolated and alone. Like no one else understands this. Could either one of you speak to that?
Yeah, for sure. And Brian, if you have anything to say, just pop up your face and then I'll stop talking. But what came to my mind as you shared that was with the 8 secrets men carry out, point number 4, that says men collude in a conspiracy of silence whose aim is to suppress their emotional truth. And it's essentially that symptom that we see is just how society is structured, that because we do not share our life experience of just reality that has occurred with us to the people that we trust in our lives or the people that we believe will kind of support us in that, it creates kind of this silo where we just say, this must be just me because I'm not hearing this anywhere else. Human beings have a tendency, as we experience life, that we see people behaviors and we see what other people are showing or projecting to us, and we see that as reality. I mean, social media has kind of exacerbated this to an exponential degree, where we see things on Instagram or Facebook and say, okay, that's reality, when really there's a lot behind those curtains. And I think when something that Jesse mentioned that I think was powerful is that in the sense when we really tap into the personal, the authentic self, it really is universal. That a lot of us, especially within this forum, since we're talking about men, a lot of us have that curtain where we project, we show off what we think is what the world needs to see, but behind there's this curtain of emotions and conflicts that we're fearful of showing to the world. So as we start to open up that curtain to other men who are trying to do that as well to heal, I think that's where we'll start seeing connections and realize that the experiences that we thought were unique to us, although they're unique in the sense that you're the one that experienced it, the core emotions that rise up is universal. And that pain, when someone can relate to that in a very non-judgmental way, is where healing can occur. Because what you have there is a connection of souls, really, of saying, I understand it, and we do not have to live in this state forever. So.
Thank you. Now, something you mentioned, Jesse, is that when you grew up in an environment where very masculine, right? Like mechanic and a tattoo. It seems like you're a little bit more open now to different, a healthier, you could say, masculinity. So where did you? What triggered that in your life? What created that possibility? What made that space for you to be able to kind of challenge and define masculinity for yourself?
Honestly, I think it was just I had such opposing forms of masculinity in my life, and my biological father is very left, very very in touch with like his feelings and his ideas and empathy, whereas my adopted father, very like right of rights, very, you work 8 jobs because that's what you do as a man. It's like you don't have days off, you have days where you do the other thing that brings in money. So it was kind of the in between, and humor was a great bridge for that, for trying to figure out like where are we and how do we feel. And my family also went through a lot of issues with addiction counseling, and so I was in therapy as a child of addicts very early on, and that kind of unlocked, okay, what is this? What does it mean to just kind of like talk about your feelings and express yourself? And I luckily was around a lot of people that really felt that that was worthwhile to share their feelings and to not hide things. And I have to say my wife is probably the best influence for me, where I had very definitive ideas of masculinity that were maybe like dangerous even. Like my dad would often tell me, you got to have your kids young, because when your son gets old enough to go through puberty, thinks he can take you, you got to be able to put them through a wall. And that's a really crazy statement to say out loud. My wife was like, nah, that's not a thing you're going to do. And really being able to get checked on that and being able to say, like, this is weird, right? Or this is, how do you feel? Or even just expressing it out loud and having someone reflect back to me. And it definitely was an ongoing process. And I think that finding a community of poets helped me to even form that more. It was this going away from my family and finding myself, going into comedy, going into poetry, and then going out and trying to figure out, like, well, what's all this mean for me, for Jesse, as my experience goes through. So it's a very long way to say, like, it's just the culmination of all these amazing people that helped me along my journey and held me accountable while calling me in rather than pushing me out.
You know, and I know this is not about me, but while you were talking about that, it made me think of, I remember when I realized I get to define masculinity for myself. That was very empowering and huge when I was able to make my choices of how I wanted to express my masculinity myself. So I think, you know, we have a question here from an attendee, and this goes to the three of you, Brian, Carlos, and Jesse. How can we better be there as an ally? How can we better be there for men during their healing? Well, I'll add a little bit to that myself, because something that was helpful for me was having people who allowed me to define my own masculinity. All right. So as an ally, you know, it's allowing people to be themselves, you know, and find themselves and their true selves. But Brian and Carlos, would you mind adding something to that, or Jesse, if you have anything to that? How can we be better allies for men during their healing?
Yeah, I think just speaking from, you know, a male perspective and not a clinical perspective now, but similar, Jorge, of just like holding that space, right? And, you know, one thing I've heard from male survivors and just men in general is, right, that worry and fear, like if they are vulnerable, how is that going to land with whoever they're telling? Are they going to be emasculated for that? So yeah, just a few thoughts.
Great, thank you for that question.
And I do see another question in the chat. I don't know if you saw that, Jorge.
Maybe not. Let me see here. Okay, here we are. As a male survivor, how do you personally navigate getting the support and help you need to feel without worry of guilt that you're taking up space for survivors who are women?
And I'm sure that can be a question for anybody in the panel, but I'll talk about my own survivorship. And honestly, it was really difficult to admit that I was a victim of sexual violence, because men, you know, there's this headspace that I had that, you know, men can't be assaulted by women. How could we be? And it really comes down to, you're not taking up space. It's not a zero-sum game. Your own process is your own process. Your own resources are your own resources. Now, it would be a different thing to go out and say, you know, there's a competition of survivorship and in some kind of obscene fashion, right? And say, like, no, men have it much worse. And sometimes, honestly, when I read the book, you know, there was some reflection that was almost like men have it just as bad, if not worse. And it's like, I don't dig that. For me, it's really like, we have to process the things in our lives in our own way. And sometimes the community that we glom onto, that we identify with, has a similar process, and we should look for that. But sometimes it doesn't, and it's just a personal journey. And for me, it was a very personal journey. There are a lot of things that rang true in this book about the shame and the fear of being found out that I was somehow a victim and somehow less than a man. But I also had to discover my own resources, and I found out again that my own personal experience wasn't that unique at all.
And I think a lot of that also is rooted in just this myth that sexual violence only happens to women, right? So as men, we feel like, whoa, that's a women's space, you know, dealing with healing, you know, those things. But it's not. And the more we can get those voices out, you know, and say like, this affects us all, you know, male, female, non-gender binary, you know, individuals, that helps us all, right? Because like you said, it's not a zero-sum game. Thank you very much. You know, Brian or Carlos, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can add a quick thought here. To add to Jesse's point, when we talk about our own personal kind of traumas and seeking out support, I always advise, or I always suggest people to identify specifically who are the people in their lives that they feel will support them, and to define what support means, right? And to yourself is like, how does that look like to me? What's the feedback that I want to receive if I were to be completely open about my experiences? And then identify the one or two people in your lives that potentially you can be vulnerable and trust with, and express your intentions in expressing that specifically to those people. When we talk in a general sense, I think that's where things can get, I guess you could say, complicated, because you're throwing yourself out and you're not sure about the feedback that you would receive. Because I imagine in some spaces, you know, the feedback may not be welcoming to you, and others, they may embrace you, you know, and that's just the reality of life. Of when we voice our thoughts, we can't control what comes back to us, and that's the part of empowerment that's so important, of knowing who you are, why, the true intention. When we talk about the shadow, right? What's your goal and your intent with sharing the story? Is it to supersede or kind of take over, or is it more of a vulnerability of, hey, I'm struggling too, and I really need help and support, or I'm at a loss here, and voicing that fear, you know, voicing that, and I think the conversations will be led into a more compassionate direction when we truly voice that, just so the context of our what's going on in our minds are well understood.
Before we wrap up this little Q&A, I would like to ask a question to the three of you on our panel, starting with Brian. I know that sometimes when I'm reading something, a lot of times there'll be something that really resonates, right? They're like, oh, this makes sense. Like where we're talking about secrets or the 7 steps to healing. But not only that, sometimes I think what I most need to understand is usually what's hardest for me to wrap my head around when I'm reading it. It's the one part that least makes sense to me. As a matter of fact, where I've worked in not only Rape Recovery Center before this, I worked with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And we used a tool called the Wheel of Power and Control to talk about how a person who is committing domestic violence or relationship violence uses these very common tactics. One of them was using male privilege. And although I could nod my head to it, I couldn't quite fully wrap my head around it until a couple of months later, I discovered that there was this wheel of equality, which is the opposite. So for every unhealthy trait, it's what a healthy relationship would look like. And so I was curious to see what's the opposite of using male privilege. And when I read it, it said shared responsibility. And all of a sudden it clicked. I'm like, oh my goodness, I've been guilty of this. I once had a job with my ex, and we worked the same hours, you know, all same day, same job. We were like 20 feet apart from each other. We only had one vehicle because we were always together. But when we got home, I would sit down and watch sports, and she would start fixing dinner, cleaning the house, taking care of the kids, and we never even questioned it. And reading that shared responsibility, we realized how I was being a part of that as well. So it was kind of interesting because I remember seeing that part and having a hard time understanding it. And at the end, it was the one that I was probably the most guilty of doing myself in my relationships. So with that in mind, I'm just thinking, like, starting with Brian, like, what is one of the secrets or steps that resonated with you most? And maybe one that you maybe had some difficulty in understanding or are having difficulty understanding.
Yeah, appreciate your sharing of that too, Jorge. I think it's like recognizing like how I'm socialized as a male, like I have to continuously on a daily pretty much reprogram myself, right, to that shared responsibility in a lot of different contexts of my life. I think one curiosity I had was the rites of passage, right? And I think of like other cultures and other countries and how they just kind of bring up young men, right? And how they, you know, certain rituals that they experience, and wondered like what that looks like, you know, in the nuances of, you know, a multicultural country that we live in. How come there isn't one? And what has been mine, just was reflecting on that, and like, you know, doing some writing on what that looks like. I know like he had mentioned in the book that it was oftentimes like football, right? This, which I could speak to as a former football player in high school. But that doesn't really resonate with me, you know, now in terms of like a healing. So yeah, I think that's kind of what was drumming up for me as I read it.
Carlos, would you mind sharing your thoughts?
Yeah, I think something that really resonated with me would probably point number 8, if men are to heal, they must activate within what they did not receive without. And I think as growing up, I grew up, just to share a personal part of my life, as a first generation American. So my parents were very into the idea of work is how you progress in life. You must go to college, and kind of create this strong scripts to make sure that my suffering is minimized. And that lifestyle in turn casts, I guess, within the book's context, a shadow over my father's experience, where he became a high functioning alcoholic, and it works, and that's how he identifies himself. So, and part of me had a longing for kind of this fatherhood and for this tribal of fathers. And I was raised a lot within point number 3, kind of the psychic economy. I mean, within the feminine. And I had an imbalance in my head of what does masculinity look like. And for a large part of my life, it was really about, I would try to seek out externally what that meant to be, or what it meant to be a man, or what it meant to be masculine. And not until I had the realization of that I get to define that within myself. And it can be, although I do not have a direct mentor, it can be in a personal introspective journey that I can take within myself. That's where, in my personal life, where empowerment really came in, and I was able to say, this is who I am. And it's a maturing process. And of course, there's a lot of bumps and ebbs and flows as we figure that out, but it's just living with that authenticity of this is who I am, and that's developing and changing day by day. So.
All right. And Jesse, would you care to share your experience?
Yeah, going through the book, I honestly really resonated with the idea of every man has a deep hunger for his father or tribal figures. I've had a lot of great male influences, and by the way, Jorge, I just want to point you to the comment section in the chat real quick. I do, when I reflect on like the loss of my grandfathers, my dad having his heart attack, my biological father passing away, and I just thought about that randomly the other day of like I used to just call him with like just to talk politics, because we kind of go along the same political path and the rest of my family. And that loss is, I yearn for it. I yearn for it. I'm sad that my children don't have access to that anymore. I think the one that I had the hardest time with was sort of the internalization, the last secret, number 8, with if men are to heal, they must activate what they did not receive from without. And I think it was probably because the author dealt with that with the least amount of detail. And you're kind of left to wonder, it's like, does this mean that you have to kind of suffer from within and like figure stuff out on your own? And yes, you do, but man, I don't think it is in a vacuum. I think it really does have to go into, you have to find the support network that like keeps you from eating yourself and getting into some kind of cycle of like self-inspection that comes into like, that becomes like totally without filter. That part probably didn't resonate as much with me as the rest.
Okay. Well, if I'm correct, I believe you have one more poem you wanted to share with us for closing before we hand it over to Willie.
Yeah, are we handing it to Willie before or after me? I guess before, unless I hear something.
Okay, let's have Willie.
I'm happy to go before. It's not a problem at all. Thank you all so much for being here this evening and sharing this space with us. This event is a part of Six Positive Week 2021. Westminster College has been putting this together for the past couple of years to draw attention to conversations about gender, sexuality, sex workers, sexual violence. These conversations that often get swept under the rug and not discussed as much as they should be, given how big of a presence that they are in a lot of our lives. So I just wanted to draw people's attention to events happening this week. Tomorrow, there's a religion and masculinity panel at 1 p.m. There's also Beating Your Face virtual Q&A with Diego Garijo, an MMA fighter and drag queen. Don't usually get those two perspectives from the same person. And that's from 7 to 8 p.m. on Zoom. Wednesday, we have Justin Torres, who's this phenomenal Latinx fiction writer, and his book, We the Animals, that was also turned into a movie. That's at 1 p.m. And then there's a Drag King makeup tutorial with Briley Poppyseed from 6 to 7 p.m. Thursdays, Queers and Kink, Masculinity Through Blood, Sweat, and Glitter with Q Wilson, Levi Otterhalt, and Levi Rose Barrett. That's at 5 to 6:30 p.m. on Zoom. And then Friday, they're wrapping stuff up with Makeup for Men with Spencer Potter, 5 to 6 p.m. on Zoom. And Saturday, there's actually an Overwatch game that they're going to be playing on Twitch from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. You can find these all on the internet. Utah Humanities, you can reach out to me if you want to know how to get these Zoom links. You can go to westminstercollege.edu.com and find them in the search function. But yeah, thank you all for being here. Real quickly, I'm going to drop a survey in the chat. If you attended this event, we'd appreciate it if you fill it out. It just helps us keep getting funding so that we can keep promoting conversations like these in the community. And since I'm on the camera, thank you so much to Eileen Chanza Torres at Westminster College. Thank you for everybody at the Rape Recovery Center. And thank you, of course, to Jesse Parent, who's been so vulnerable and, strong and courageous here with us this evening. This has been a really valuable dialogue. Take it away, Jesse.
All right, I guess I got one last poem to do. Speaking of masculinity, this is a poem that is an exploration into masculinity that is meant to also kind of turn it on its head. It's also the poem that I'm probably the best known for. To the boys who may one day date my daughter, I have been waiting for you. Since before her birth, since before my spark took hold and ignited the fire in her mother's belly, I have been training to kill you. When you took your first steps, I was preparing to make it so you never walked again. When you played at war, I was perfecting headshots. You can't catch up at this point. And when you first see my daughter and fall in love with the look she sends over her shoulder, her crescent moon eyes framing her laughing smile, you are going to want to talk to her. When those hours pass by like sprinters during that first timeless conversation, you will also know, with a deep and impending sense of dread, that you are going to have to talk to me when you first come to my home and see the bone carving over my threshold. Try not to imagine your own femurs so expertly carved. Pay no attention to my ample crawl space, my room with a rubber mat and a drain. Be careful to only approach me with love. For my daughter, see, I have been seeding her childhood with taproot hugs to weed out indifference and apathy. There will be no daddy issues for your teenage talons to latch upon. If you break her heart, I will hear it. With the ear I pressed against her mother's belly, the elbow I cradled her head in will send a message to my fist. My cheeks are attuned to her lips. I will know if they tremble. I have taught her that a man should never hit a woman. Now, her mother would like to add that she really shouldn't ever hit anybody. I've taught her a man should never hit a woman. Consider my genes a mark of Cain. You will suffer 7 times whatever you do to her, and she will not keep your secrets. You can't make fire feel afraid. I have been trying to teach her love all her life, and all that I ask is that you continue the lesson. Love her, befriend her, protect her, be there when I can't, and when my body gives up to the grave, let the grin that eternity carves into my face be a reflection of the peace that your love brings to her, and we should get along just fine. Addendum. To the girls who may one day date my daughter, My wife is a better shot than I am. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Rape Recovery Center. Thank you, everyone in this whole panel. And thank you to the audience. I really appreciated being here. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Jesse. To learn more about Jesse's work, visit jesseparent.com. As well as you can find a lot of his poems and performances on YouTube. I know I'll be looking them up and sharing them around. So thank you, everyone, for your time.